Okay, I think we're gonna kick it off. Welcome back to Ridge Vineyard's Winemaker Roundtable. We began the roundtables last spring about this time when we were all hunkered down with stay-at-home orders, and we continued the roundtables for several months after that, and we covered some great topics. We tasted some great wines. We included things like oddball varieties, library wines, and even a Chardonnay tasting. So that was great fun, and we had great reception from you to those tastings. So after a hiatus, we're back, and really happy to be with you again. I'm David Amadia. I'm the president of Ridge, and I'll be hosting today's tasting. So a couple of housekeeping items for you out there. If you have questions for the production team today, please use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many of those questions live as possible. We also have some Ridge team members monitoring, and they'll answer those questions online as well in writing. If you just like to check in with us, use the chat function. Let us know where you're at, what you're drinking, how you're doing. So feel free to use the chat function and socialize with other people online. Today, we're going to focus on our spring Z-List releases. Our Z-List program is solely focused on Zinfandel, and the program's wines are made up of our national release Zinfandels, primarily representing some of the best single-site Zinfandels that we produce, including Linton Springs, Geyserville, East Bench, and Pagani Ranch. The program also includes optional Zinfandels, and we'll be tasting one of those today. So this afternoon, we'll be tasting 4 wines with you. The wines in order are 1, the 2019 Paso Robles, 2, the 2019 East Bench, 3, we'll do the 2018 Oltranti, and then we'll finish up with the 2019 Geyserville. So those are the wines in order. Let me introduce the panel for you. First, David Gates. David is our Senior Vice President of Vineyard Operations and has been with Ridge since 1989. And we're happy to have David with us today. John Olney, who's our head winemaker, recently promoted to head winemaker at Ridge and has been with the winery since 1996. John, good to see you. Thanks for joining. And third, we have Mark Vernon, who's our CEO and heads up all of our production team and has been with Ridge since 1998. Which was a cool, damp harvest, Mark, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it was.
But thank you all for joining us today. So why don't we kick it off with the first wine, which is the 2019 Paso. And maybe, David, I'll ask you to start off and maybe talk a little bit about this site. It's the southernmost site that we source any grape from, and talk a little bit about our history with that vineyard also.
Absolutely, thanks. Welcome, everyone. Paso Robles is a great spot for Zinfandel. Ridge, the first Ridge Zinfandel from here this is actually a pre-Paul Draper wine. It's 1967. Dave Benyon, the first winemaker, founding winemaker at Ridge Vineyards, became good friends with Benito Ducey. That has a little ranch down just south of the town of Paso Robles, right off the freeway. And so we've been making this wine, the first vintage, 1967. From 1970, we took a little hiatus. And then from 1976 on, we've been making it every year. Benny was a sweetheart. He passed away a year and a half ago, unfortunately. But his nephew, Mike Ducey, and Mike's family has been taking over the farming. In fact, Mike been helping Benny out for the last 6-7 years. And they've taken over the farming and they do a fantastic job. It's calcareous soil, but it's all river wash. So the river, the Salinas River runs right through the property, right next to the railroad tracks. And all the soil there is just recent wash and lots of gravel. And the vines are widely spaced, as is typical. The oldest vines there are planted in the early 1920s. Which is when the Ducey family bought the property, and beautiful vines, bushy vines. The oldest vines were own rooted, which was very common back then. And that, remember, 1924 is the middle of Prohibition, and the Ducey family actually bought it because they had a boarding house and a restaurant, and they were, giving a little dark water on the side for their boarders. And became very successful with it, and it eventually purchased another ranch. And then Mike Ducey, and who was Dante's son, Benny's nephew, has become quite successful, and they have almost 1,000 acres now in Paso that they farm and manage. So we're really happy to work with them. Zinfandel from Paso Robles is always mouth-watering and big. It always has good acid. Not as good as Geyserville though, but a totally different flavor profile. So big, voluminous. It really fills up your mouth, but not a lot of tannin either. So it's smooth and it makes a beautiful polished Zinfandel.
When you were talking, David, and talking about the history of the vineyard, we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary, or getting close to that, for the first plantings at that site, correct?
Absolutely, and there it is on the Historic Vineyard Society's registry of historic vineyards. It's about a little over 20 acres of grapes. There are probably 4 or 5 acres of the own-rooted vines surviving from the original plantings. The rest of them started to die slowly from phylloxera, which is a little root louse that attacks the roots and kills vines. We combat that with Native American rootstocks and hybrid rootstocks. So Benito Ducey, for starting about 45 years ago, would if there were 50 vines that died one year, he would replant those on the resistant rootstock. And so the majority of the vineyard now is between 3 and 50 years old, with the oldest vines, of course, being almost 100 years old. And those old vines, we still lose a few now and then, but it goes very slowly.
Hey,
And
Dave,
then,
I was going to say, Dave, talk a little bit about the Benito Ducey vineyard versus the Dante Ducey vineyard, because I see a few questions about the D Ducey vineyards. So.
Yeah, so there were two of the 3 Ducey brothers let's see, Dante. Well, Benny never married, and but Dante did. So when Sylvester and I can't remember his mom's name. Anyway, when they passed away, they split the 2 properties, so that eventually they had 2 properties, one on the east side of 101 and one on the west side of 101, both in the Templeton Gap. So Dante got the little bit bigger piece because he had a family, and Benny got the smaller piece that was their home ranch. Dante having a family, you have to remember, this is from the 50s and early 60s. It was hard to sell grapes, and so Dante pulled out a lot of the oldest vines that were planted in the 20s on his property to plant wheat, because wheat was a cash crop and he couldn't get anything for the grapes. And Benny never let Dante forget that. It was really fun listening to them talk. But Dante, the Dante Ducey vineyard supplies grapes to many different wineries, including Turley gets the oldest vines there, and Janelle Ducey, who is Dante's granddaughter, Mike Ducey's daughter, it has a J. Ducey Wines, and she makes a little bit of grapes from both Benny and Dante's vineyard, and it's a really neat little tribute to her two Duceys, 2 Ducey ranches. So I hope that explained it.
Yeah. In good detail. Thanks, David.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. John, let me ask you a little bit about the winemaking on the wine. This was made with a submerged cap. Other Zinfandels here are made with floating caps. So can you talk about what the difference is in the winemaking and what impact that has on the wine?
Sure. So it's interesting. We actually have, we have the Paso Robles, and then right after it, we're going to have the East Bench. And these are 2 of our only Zinfandels that we make, which are 100% Zinfandel. And, Zinfandel is a grape, even though, it certainly generates a lot of sugar. You put it out in the sun, it makes a very ripe wine, a wine with a lot of fruit. It doesn't necessarily on its own have that deep of a color, which is one of the reasons I think a lot of the old vines vineyards had Petit Syrah interplanted with it. So what we found is when we bring it in, we crush the grapes completely. to really open up the skins, get the color out of them. And then we put in it's a metal grid that's perforated, and you put it down, and essentially what you're doing is you're holding the skins under the remaining liquid. Since if you don't, in your typical fermentation, as the wine ferments, the carbon dioxide that it generates will push the cap up and separate it from the rest of the juice. So it's a way really to maximize extraction and do it in a gentle way.
So you sort of pick and choose, John, in terms of if maybe it's a particularly light vintage in terms of color, you're more likely to use submerged cap, or maybe you would do it with certain lots and not other lots. So that's all sort of part of the process you go through.
Yeah, absolutely. You never quite know exactly what you're going to do until you see the grapes. But in 2019, the rainy season prior to the growing season in 2019, we had a lot of rainfall, which is important down in Paso, where it can be very, very dry and arid. So I think that really helped the vines to sort of set a full crop, full canopy, and made wines that, there's a kind of a theme I see through a lot of the 2019 Zins, which is this, they're really polished, sort of streamlined in a way. I think using the submerged cap really helped to fill them out and give them a little more structure to sort of add to that beautiful fruit.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the 2019 harvest and reading the notes and seeing we had double rainfall. We had over 60 inches of rainfall in 2019, and looking at where we are today. And I mean, how many inches do we have today, David, up in Sonoma County?
Down in Paso? We're almost to a little over 14 inches at Lytton Springs, and under that about 12 and a half at Geyserville. So usually we're in the 30s there, 35, 30, 35. So it's very dry.
Yeah. And that's really kind of what we're seeing with climate change, is these real extremes, isn't it, David? In terms of one year we'll have double rainfall, and then we'll only have half rainfall for 3 years after that. So it's a real challenge from a farming perspective.
And the other thing that we seem to be a little more susceptible of in the summer are heat spikes that are really drying heat spikes. So there's a term called vapor pressure deficit. It's kind of the amount of drying power of the atmosphere, and it's off the charts, and it can really cause havoc to grapevines, especially close to harvest when they're at their most delicate stage.
Okay. So why don't we go to the East Bench, and Mark, maybe I'll ask you to kick this off. This is 100% Zin from Dry Creek and Estate Wine, but maybe talk a little bit about this site and our history there.
Sure. So, actually, not long after I started working at Ridge, we were contacted by a gentleman who owned property right next door to our Lytton Springs vineyards, and he asked us if we might be interested in working with him to develop a vineyard on his property. And he has a beautiful piece of land up on what we call the bench lands above the Dry Creek Valley, but still part of the Dry Creek AVA. And so we had grapes growing on our property right up to the fence line, and then it stopped. And then his property, for many years, he'd been using it for cattle. And so the ground, we could see, had been well fertilized. And we had a feeling that maybe if we were able to plant some wine grapes there, that we would get the similar high quality results that we had seen from our Lytton Springs vineyard. So I was able to work together with David Gates on coming up with a negotiation with our neighbor to allow us to lease the property, and then in conjunction with him to develop a Zinfandel vineyard there. And so we So we planted the vineyard and did the development work back around the year 2000, and it was really probably one of the last 100% Zinfandel vineyards that Ridge planted. We were still in that mode at that point where we were doing what was kind of the conventional thing, which was to plant blocks or vineyards to a single varietal. And if you wanted to use a separate varietal together, you might plant some of that in a block, neighboring block. But we chose to go with Zin, and the vineyard, as soon as it was planted, it just grew very well. And I think we can contribute a lot of that to that history of, many years of cattle being there. And also the fact that grapes hadn't been growing there for a long time. Nothing, sometimes it's good for the land to rest. And when you have a vineyard on a piece of ground for tens or even 100+ years, you can have an issue where the soil might be depleted depending on how the farming was being done. So in this particular case, we had this ground that may well have had vineyard on it 50 years ago, but had a chance to rest and had a chance to have a lot of organic matter included. So we planted it, and boy, I'll tell you, the first couple of years, the quantity of grapes that came in, I will never forget the look on John's face when he he realized that the yields from that vineyard were a little higher than most of the rest of the vineyards that we were used to working with. And so it was a very precocious vineyard in its youth in terms of producing fruit. And yet, even at fairly high yields, we could see really good quality in the fruit almost from the beginning. But what's also been fascinating to watch is as the vineyard has matured and gained time, in the beginning, it was just extremely bright and expressive fruit. It was very delicious, but it was young. And as the vineyards matured, we've seen that the fruit take on more complexity. It's still very much a bright Zinfandel based flavor to the wine, and yet it actually now starts to, it has more complexity and maybe even develops a little more complexity over time as well. So I think I've really enjoyed watching this vineyard go from when we first planted it to where we are now, and how that has changed. And along with that, of course, the vine settled down and the yields kind of stabilized, and not quite as much fruit coming off as there were in those early years. So I think with that, I'll let John pick it up and explain a little bit more about how he makes the wine and his thoughts about it as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, like Mark said, it's a really beautiful spot right up on top of the bench. Very uniform soils. David could give us the details on exactly, the makeup of the soils, but I was always struck, originally going back into 1999 and 2000 when we planted the vineyard. There's a softness to the soils that's a little different than some of the other soils you see, in neighboring areas, which typically has a little more clay. And my theory is I really think the roots penetrate in that vineyard really, really well. And consequently, when they were young, produced a lot of grapes. And for the first 3 years that we started harvesting the grapes, we were putting it into 3 valleys. So 2006 was actually the first year where we made an East bench. And, in slight contrast to what we were saying about the Paso, with the East bench, I think, again, maybe it's related to the soils, but the skins are a little thicker. There's a little bit more color. It's a wine that when you just crush it and just do pump overs, in other words, without the submerged cap, you really get a wine that's quite structured. So we really, usually don't need to use that technique when we're fermenting the East bench. But it's interesting. We're Dave and I were tasting this a week or so ago with James Suckling, the journalist, who who tasted it and sort of said, wow, it's almost like there's a little bit of Pinot in it, which is really, there's something really, I don't know, there's this elegance and fruit expression in the 19 that I really liked. And,
yeah. The other thing that James Suckling talked about, John, we were tasting with them, and I think you first mentioned it and he really latched onto it, was the fact that our Zinfandels have a weightless quality to them. And, you know, I think people are used to Zinfandels that are heavy and really weigh you down, but our wines, you know, have this weightless quality. And, you know, what do you attribute that to versus, you know, the vast majority of what you see produced in California?
well, I think when, you know, especially when we're talking about Zinfandel, you know, I would say the most important factor is picking the grapes at the right point, you know, picking them when they're ripe but not overripe. And, you know, with Zinfandel, especially since, you know, we grow a lot of Zinfandel up here in Sonoma County. And since the climate is relatively similar, you know, it follows that if you have the same varietal, you know, they're all going to ripen more or less about the same time. So, you know, we really have to be ready. You know, and David has a full crew on alert when as the grapes get closer to ripening, and we're able to really pick them at that perfect moment. Because if you leave Zinfandel out even 48 hours, you know, too long, it will shrivel very quickly, which then concentrates all that sugar, and that translates into a wine after it ferments, which is, you know, high in alcohol and doesn't have that weightlessness. Now it's, you know, it's really, you know, it's heavy. You know, it just doesn't have that balance.
That's right. Yeah. And David, can you talk a little bit? I mean, the East Bench Vineyard abuts Lytton Springs. Are there any climatic differences? What are the soil differences between the two sites?
So you could argue that there's a little bit of a climate difference between the benchland and the flats, just because it's going to get a little bit cooler in the morning and on the flats, and a little less so, a little bit warmer at night on the hills. But we're talking like, you know, 50, 60 feet in elevation, and it's really not much climatically different. Lytton Springs, what the soils that go in, of the blocks that go into Lytton Springs, there are 5 different soil types. One of them being the East Bench soil type, and the biggest difference with the benchland soils, and actually East Bench in particular, is that it's at the very top of the bench. So there's a lot less erosion. But most of the Lytton Springs blocks that have that same soil series are kind of on the side slopes, so they've been eroded a little bit more. And as Mark said, they've had grapes on them grapes or orchards for you know, for many years, over 100 years. And the soil is actually an old ocean bed that has since been lifted up, and it's fairly. So I would say, if you look at the soils at Paso Robles, because they're recent alluvium, they're like 1 or 2 million years old, like Geyserville. But East Bench is like middle-aged in terms of Northern California soils, so like 40 or 50 million years old, something like that. Which means that they're well weathered, and that they do have more clay in them, because the clay kind of stays and everything else goes away. But yeah, but they're it's beautiful, very, like as John said, very uniform, and yeah, nice soils.
So we're kind of at halftime of the show here. So before we go to the second 2 wines, we have a bunch of questions, and they're kind of sort of a melange. So maybe we can deal with a couple of them before we move to the third wine. But yeah, David, you mentioned the Historic Vineyard Society. How many of our vineyards that we make wines from are part of that society?
Oh gosh, let's see. Paso Robles, Montebello, Jimsomere, Evangelo, Pagani, Bedrock, Lytton Springs, Geyserville, Mazzoni / Oltranti, Buchignani. Let's see. I'm trying to think. San Lorenzo. I could go on. Freddie Amy.
But it's more than 10.
Yeah, but yeah, we have a few.
Okay. Good. All right. And then let's see. There was another question I wanted to ask you guys before we move forward. And it might have been answered already. Let me see. And John, maybe you can take this one. Why we use the name Primitivo on wine, a wine from Lytton Estate? Why do we use that name instead of Zinfandel?
Because it comes from a single block, which we actually planted using, using budwood, which was Primitivo. In other words, it's that clone or selection that is, very related to Zinfandel, but is considered distinct when you're actually buying budwood.
Yeah.
And we could segue into the discussion about Cyrillianic and Tribby Drive.
Sure.
Be here for a few hours. I mean, David, do you want to expand at all in terms of just
Yep. Or
the
actually,
notion of Primitivo?
I'll jump in for 1 second and just say that part of it is the fact that Primitivo had been known and discussed and talked about as a variety in Italy, and that was known before all the genetic work was done to realize that in fact Primitivo is essentially the same as Zinfandel, as well as these few vines that have been located in Croatia, which is believed to be the origin point for Zinfandel. So what happened is, because Primitivo was known before the genetic work was all done, it developed its own identity in Italy. And then when some of that material was brought to the United States, the regulators here classified that as a separate varietal from Zinfandel, because at that time when that was done, it wasn't known that they were in fact the same. So, and what's interesting is the regulators have not changed the regulations since the DNA and genetic work was done. And so one day they might change that, but so far they haven't. So that's why we actually still refer to Primitivo separately from Zinfandel, even though we know that it's basically the same variety. Obviously there's small differences in the genetics between any given grapevine and those from Italy, and the Primitivo may be a little bit different than all the different vines we find in California. So with that, maybe Dave Gates, you can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, I'd love to talk about a little bit about the genetics and the variability. So the grapevines have somatic changes in their chromosomes that can create different clones and different varieties. Think Pinot Noir, which is a really ancient grape. There are many clones of Pinot Noir, and they're quite different from each other. And then there are two other distinct varieties that come from Pinot Noir: Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. They just lost their ability to make different anthocyanin, basically. The difference between the Primitivo that we have in California and the Zinfandel clones that we have in California are significant. Primitivo has smaller clusters, less berries per cluster. It gets ripe a little bit faster. So it has a little bit different flavor profile. It looks like the two Tribidrog clones that we have planted at Lytton West, they seem to be a little bit different too, which leads kind of credence to the fact that Zinfandel is an old variety. Where it came from is old, and so it dispersed from Croatia, that whole side of the Mediterranean. It went to the Puglia and became known as Primitivo. It went via New England to California and became known as Zinfandel. And there are differences, which is really cool, because that means, to me, it means that it's an ancient variety.
Yeah, there's probably the best book on grape varietals was written by Jose Guillemais and well, he was part of
Jancis.
yeah, Jancis. And he explained it to me in a really a way that really stuck for me. He said, you know, if you look at your right hand and your left hand, there's probably slight differences in the chromosomes between your right forefinger and your left forefinger, but we don't notice it because it doesn't really, it functions the same and it looks the same. But if one day, you know, there's a slight mutation and suddenly our index finger becomes the longest finger on our hand, well, then we notice it. And that's kind of, you know, that's in a way that's sort of like, you know, Primitivo, you know, went over to Italy, started growing on its own, and it does have, I think it has slightly looser, smaller bunches, even though we know it comes from the same genetic home as Zin.
Yeah, it's great. It's fun. That's the fun part about growing grapes for
Yep.
me. And
It's always changing.
yes, absolutely.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'll try to keep my huskies quiet over here, but I'm having trouble. I think
They
we're
like
gonna
Zin,
move-
huh? Is that the thing, David? They like Zin?
They're just rambunctious. So we'll move to the third wine, which is an optional wine. It's a ATP wine. The name is Oltranti, but it actually, that's not the name of the vineyard, David, is it?
No, so well, it's the Oltrantis own the vineyard. They've
Yeah.
Flora and Nick Oltranti bought the property in the mid 1980s, and their family is running it now. So it's just north of the town of Geyserville, and it was originally planted by Giuseppe Mazzoni. So he was the first winemaker for Italian Swiss Colony, which is kind of halfway between Geyserville and Cloverdale. And one of the deals that Italian Swiss Colony made for their people is that if they worked so many years, they got some land. And Mazzoni planted it and actually had a winery there that closed down right after, or I think it closed during Prohibition or right after. And there are some vines there that are surviving that we typically make into Mazzoni Home Ranch. There are some younger vines that Nick and Flora planted that would, a little bit of that could contribute to the Mazzoni Home Ranch, or it would go into Three Valleys. Occasionally, if it turned out really well, we'd make it into Oltranti, when we call it the Oltranti Zinfandel. We decided in 2018 to call this wine Oltranti because it got pretty ripe. So by the time we picked it, I think it's a little over 15% alcohol. And so it did not fit the flavor profile that we typically expect of the Mazzoni Home Ranch. And so, but it's still a beautiful wine. And so we ended up calling it Oltranti Zinfandel. And so it does include the old vines, which have a little bit of Carignan, which to me is the backbone of the wine. And then some older mixed Zin, and then the terraces that you see in the background there are all the young Zin that Nick planted along with some olive trees. And it's a great place. If you're driving south from Cloverdale toward Geyserville, there's this great old barn that has Dr. Pierce's elixir or something like that. And that's and then this yeah, you can't miss it. Once you know it, you can't miss it.
Yeah, so
yeah,
easy to identify.
Yes, and there's some beautiful old vines, and it's a great snapshot of what people were doing in the late 1890s, which is when the oldest vines were planted. So there's some patches that are mostly Zin, patches that are mostly Carignan, but they're always mixed.
Yeah. And John, this is a 2018 vintage, and it definitely stands out from the 319s to me. It's got a different character. It was a drier winter. It's just a little more concentrated, a little bolder, I'd say.
Yeah, no question about it. It's a great, it's a great contrast to the 19s. I mean, we're still, we're about 5 or 6 miles away from East Bench, so we're relatively in the same sort of climate here. And yet the 18s really were, they were wines that had lots of structure to them, lots of tannin, as you know, bold, there's almost this, for me, there's kind of this rustic quality to the 18s in general, and I think specifically for the Oltranti. Like David said, they're the vineyard parcels that go into this wine are planted sort of on terraces that kind of go around the flats below. They get a lot of stress, so they come in really, really concentrated. And having that little bit of Carignan, it's not even 10%, but I think it's really important in terms of sort of maintaining the acidity of the wine.
Yes.
Kind of holds it together.
David, do you want to talk? I mean, people are asking about the 18 versus the 19 vintage. Do you want to, from your perspective, from a viticulture perspective, talk about the differences between the 2 years?
Sure. I would say that of the last 10 vintages, 12 and 18 were the most normal.
Okay.
The rest of them were kind of impacted by the drought. 18, the drought had been broken in 2017, but 2018 was a little bit on the low side for water, but there's still some residual moisture deep down, but it was a nice even year. So by that I mean it got cold enough in the winter, so bud break happened, normally the end of mid-March to the end of March. The vines grew nicely. There weren't any really bad heat spikes until right near harvest, so we had to hustle to get things in. And made very structured wines, lower crop though, because we had a little bit of rain, a bloom that kind of set the vines back just a little bit. 19 was kind of the opposite. So it was one of those years that it seemed like every weekend it was raining, and it rained. I mean, double the rain. We were over 60 inches in Geyserville, and the vines showed that. So they not only did they grow quite a bit, but they put out a pretty good crop. And Zinfandel is funny because if it's a dry year, the clusters will start out pretty big, but you lose a lot of weight. So if you estimate, they're always below average weight. It doesn't matter how good the set was or whatever. In a wet year, they just keep expanding and keep growing. And so it was very bountiful in 2019. Fortunately, the weather at harvest was mild. Relatively mild for Northern California and the Valley. So we had some time to pick, because there was John was full pretty quickly. I think you turned your tanks 3 times, I think, at least, and in 2019, and thankfully, it was bountiful. It reminded me a little bit of 1997, which was although it was a little bit later than that, but almost about as much fruit. So it was a pretty good year.
So John, typically with the Mazzoni, we usually get that in at a lower alcohol level because it's almost exclusively old vines. So is there an analogy between the Oltranti and like our old school, which comes from Geyserville? Is that a fair analogy between those 2 wines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Certainly in the sense that, one of the biggest differences, if you're looking at the Mazzoni and Oltranti, is in the Mazzoni, I mean, we can have what, David? We can have 35%, upwards towards 40% of non-Zinfandel, mostly Carignan, and some Petit Syrah. So, Carignan really, one of its magical qualities is its ability to just sit out in the sun. It's like the cactus of grape varietals, and whereas Zinfandel, the sugars just sort of start shooting up. Carignan just gradually comes along. So when you pick Carignan with Zinfandel, it generally is riper at a lower sugar, and that helps sort of moderate the overall final alcohol in the wine.
Okay.
Especially when you're co-fermenting it.
Yeah, for those who haven't had a Mazzoni, I'd really recommend it. It's just a fabulous wine that ages beautifully as well. I think one of my favorite ATP wines. So why don't we move to our 4th wine, which is the Geyserville 2019 vintage. And Mark, maybe I'll ask you to kick it off. This is a vineyard we've been working with for more than 50 consecutive years, and certainly what we consider one of the very top Zinfandel vineyards in California.
Yeah, thank you, David. In fact, sometimes people ask us which one is your favorite wine, what's your favorite Zin, and our slick answer is, oh, they're all our children. I can't play favorites. But then if someone really twists your arm hard enough, then you might actually admit to which wine is your favorite. And for me, for our Zins, the two that I like the most are the Lytton Springs and the Geyserville. And the Geyserville, I think, is especially interesting because it really is unique. It just has a very identifiable character to it. And it's I think it's just a beautiful wine with great complexity, ability to age. It'll taste great almost right from the beginning most of the time. And yet it will just evolve over time, and it's almost always a pleasure for me to drink almost at any time. The complexity, I think, comes from the fact that it is a blend, and it has a pretty good amount of Carignan in it each year, and I think the Carignan really adds some really wonderful elements to the wine. It brings some freshness and acidity, but it also adds fruit, and it makes it very, very enjoyable. The vines, the oldest vines at Geyserville are the oldest vines that we farm. We call it the Old Patch, and I'll let Dave talk a little bit more about that in detail, but it's just a remarkable piece of ground with just these incredible vines that, you just think about the history that those vines have seen. It's just remarkable. And what's also remarkable is that they're still fairly fruitful, and they give us just incredibly great quality grapes year in and year out. It's just an amazing thing. Especially, we have the vineyard is on a special section of soil that was laid down by the Russian River, so the river's not that far from the vineyard. But what's interesting is that as you move away from the Russian River, the soil actually undergoes quite a bit of change. And we think we're right in the sweet spot here for producing these incredible grapes. There's this great mixture of rock and some clay and other soils that have been laid down in the past, which again, David can give you a little more detail on. So it's the vineyard itself, Ridge leased for many, many years from the Trentadue family. And then we had the great good fortune to purchase it a few years ago, and now we own it, and which will ensure the fact that we'll be able to continue producing Geyserville forever. We have been able to buy some grapes and or lease some additional vineyard that is contiguous to the heart of the Geyserville vineyard that lies along this same strip of soil. So we've spent a lot of time examining the ground, and where there's some additional vineyard that is growing in the same wonderful soil, we've been able to, like I say, secure some additional fruit. And be able to make a little bit more Geyserville. We have such a demand for the Geyserville that, Dave and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can we get our hands on any more fruit that's growing in this Goldilocks zone, right, Dave? So maybe you can, with that, tell us a little bit more about this in detail.
Yeah, well, the soil is alluvium, as you said, lots of cobblestones, so river rock, all rounded, and very deep soil. The deeper you go, the more rock you find, and it's this neat little stretch. It goes if you go closer to the Russian River, you get into some really heavy clay soils, and if you go further into the hills on the other side of the freeway, you get into a different kind of series that's older soils that it's eroded, similar to what we have on the benchland at Lytton Springs. But in between that is this magical spot. Unfortunately, I'd say half of it is either freeway or winery buildings, and not or other varieties besides, mixed Zin.
I tried
But
to
it-
talk Dave into planting grapes in the median in the freeway, but he wouldn't go for that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the farming would be a little too treacherous, I think,
be
right?
quite dangerous. You'd have to go underneath or something. What's neat about this is it's kind of the plantings are the old patch was planted in the 1890s, and the new patch planted in 2000. They're both mixed vineyards, so we kind of mixed it up. We tried to kind of replicate similarly to what we have in the old patch, but a little bit heavier on Zin on the new patch. Everything in between that is are more monovarietal wines, although the 3 blocks of Zinfandel planted in the 60s have a little bit of other varieties in them, not much. We did convert one of them to, we kind of doubled up the planting. So we did inner plants, and there were 8 by 12, now they're 6 by 8 plantings. And so in those inner plants, we mixed it up, and that has been a good success. And so I think we'll convert the other 2 blocks to it. But that's kind of the heart of this wine, are those mixed plantings. It makes there's something about co-fermentation that really adds this lusciousness to the wine, and then that Carignan gives it this gravelly, I call it a kind of a gravelly aftertaste. So it's acidic and there's tannin there, but it just kind of bumbles along, kind of like the river, I love that. Always a long finish.
That's a great explanation, David. I mean, the thing for me with Geyserville is the 20% Carignan always in the blend, the rocky soil. It creates this amazing freshness in the wine, and that's where I'm going to kind of toss it to you, John. Is that this is a technical term, but the pH on this wine is 3.54, and for those who don't know, that means it's a pretty fresh wine. And usually, if a Zinfandel has that level of freshness, it's been acidified. But Geyserville, that's all natural acidity. You want to talk about how unique that is and why that makes it such a special wine?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's unique to start with because when you're in a warm climate, most varietals, but certainly Zinfandel, as they produce sugar, they do that at the expense of acid. And the trick is always about picking the grapes when they're ripe, but when they haven't given up enough acid. And one of the magical things about Geyserville is that even the Zinfandel really holds its acid very well. But then on top of it was 20% Carignan. And we mentioned Carignan before, and one of its great features is the ability to ripen at lower sugars, but it also has this really, really nice acidity that it brings to the blend, especially when you're co-fermenting them. And the acidity, when we think of acidity, we think of you sort of think of sourness, someone squoze a lemon and gave that to you. But really, when we're talking about wine, it really is more a question of where the pH is, because that's very critical. Because at a lower pH, so a higher acid, but at a lower pH, it really shifts the whole spectrum, the whole flavor spectrum, towards more of that kind of black cherry, red fruit, and gives it that what we've been talking about in terms of like a liveliness, a freshness, and it really it's a big part of the character of the wine.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is, and there seems there's been quite a few people that are been asking questions, also attended the suckling tasting with us, and that James had opened a 75 Geyserville, I think, a day or two before the tasting. So I think the acidity, the natural acidity of this wine also adds to the longevity and ageability of the wine, John, as well, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. When you have a pH that's under 3.6, which when we're talking about this one at 3.54, it really holds your color and your tannin. It holds it all together. When you start getting up into higher pHs, a lot of times, the wine kind of color starts to fall out, and now the tannins are more exposed. So, that's definitely, it makes it very tight knit and helps it to age.
Okay. Well, we've got a whole slew of questions here. So before we sign off, I'm going to try to take a stab at getting some of these over to you guys to feel. So yeah, I see Mike Thiessen's asked a couple of questions, and Mike is a great longtime supporter of Ridge from Kansas City, and I'm glad to see him online today. So Mike was asking actually about the Occidental Vineyard, David, and why we stopped making wine from there. And do you know what's happening with that vineyard right now?
Oh my gosh. So that's on a little hillside up above the town of Occidental, way out on towards the coast. And Paul made it 1 or 2 years, and I think there was I think that it was the 70 or 71 Occidental what year did you say? It was
he just said the 1970 was stunning. So
70, yeah. So the
okay.
70 was
Yeah.
70 was a year that was a good year. Things got fairly ripe. And the Occidental Vineyard, in fact, was picked fairly ripe. So it had screaming acid, as much as the Geyserville, maybe even a little bit more, and a little bit of residual sugar. And it was, I've had it a couple of times, but it's been 15 years since I've had it. Amazing wine, but the owners at the time were not that easy to get along with.
Okay.
So
there you go.
It was one of those, 1 or 2 years, and then went along. But I believe, oh gosh, well, let me think of the name. Odomino is making the wine, I believe so.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Odomino. I believe they're still making the wine. The vines are still there.
They're there.
They've gone through some ownership changes and different management changes, and it's a neat little spot for Zin. It's up above the low-lying fog in the Russian River, and in good years and in warmer years, it can just be beautiful.
I'm guessing in the redwoods too, probably, right, in Occidental?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
The ones that haven't been cut down are pretty big. Yeah.
So John, we've had a couple of questions also. Obviously, people are curious about the 20 vintage and the impact of the wildfires, that started in August. And obviously our experience is a little bit different in Lytton Springs than it was at Montebello. But since you're dealing with both of those right now, maybe you want to talk about sort of what our experiences were and what impact that had on our harvest.
Yeah, sure. I mean, really, obviously we had never we'd never experienced fire during harvest. In other words, while we still had grapes on the vine, we all of the prior fires had been at the very, very tail end of the season when everything's in the winery. So, this was a much bigger challenge, both logistically and also about the concern that the smoke has on the grapes. And what we learned pretty quickly, for one thing, that it's really much more complicated than you can imagine. But one of the things that you hear people say frequently, you watch a report about somewhere where there's been a fire that came through a community and 6 houses are burned down, and then the one right next to it is completely untouched.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that as well. There were a few vineyards where they were burned down in the sense that there was definite smoke taint, and we either did not pick the grapes or just did not use the wine. And then most of them, amazingly, were escaped the effect. I think the fact that we are speaking about our vineyards in Sonoma, we are primarily just east of where the main fire concerns coming off the Walbridge fire headed with the winds. And the same thing at Montebello. We were north and east of where the fires were occurring. So, I think I think overall we got really lucky. We did, like I said, we did have to declassify some wines and had to, and there were a handful of vineyards or vineyard blocks that we didn't pick.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Obviously, people are concerned and interested in that, and honestly, it took us a while to sort it out. Like you said, it was a much more complicated issue than we could ever imagine, and we had never dealt with it with fires at the beginning of harvest. We had dealt with fires a few times towards the end of harvest where we had already picked our grapes. So it was a bit of a learning experience, but I think, our hearts go out to a lot of the wineries, particularly in the Upper Napa Valley, that pretty much lost their entire crop. And we just thank our lucky stars that we were a little bit more fortunate. And although, we'd have had to do away with a small amount of wine, for the most part, we're going to have a 20 vintage. So we're feeling fortunate about that. David, maybe do you want to talk about, let me just find the question here. I'm sorry. I'm looking. So in terms of ageability of Zinfandel, David, I mean, oftentimes with Cabernet in particular, people talk about a dumb stage for the wine. Is that also true for Zinfandel? Can it go through a dumb stage? And if so, is there sort of a certain time period that might occur?
I wouldn't say that it necessarily goes through a dumb stage that you would find in Montebello for sure. But it does reach a point, say, maybe after 10 years, where it might get a little bit out of whack. So it might have lost all of its fresh fruit, but the tannins haven't softened enough. And I'm talking about possibly Lytton Springs or Geyserville. But if it is, it's not much that you would notice. Typically, though, the fresher flavors of the wine, it's better, in the first, within, I'd say, between 6 and 10 years. Wouldn't you say, John, Mark, that they're the most enjoyable for their fresh fruit and that deliciousness. And then if you like aged wines, that you can choose some years or some vineyards like Geyserville or Lytton, and they can age out beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a little bit different than Cabernet or Montebello, where those wines really can shut down for a period of time. But I haven't really had that experience with our aged Zinfandels. They're pretty consistent in terms of their aging.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that especially on the young wines, young Zins, that if you can aerate the wine, that either double decant or you use one of those funky little
aerators.
Aerators. It works. It helps.
And you would do that for like the first 5 years after vintage, David, that you'd suggest that type of aeration, either decanting or otherwise?
Yeah, for me, I'd say, the first 3 or so, 3 to 4 years, something like that.
Yeah. John, we had a question on the winemaking side about the impact of seeds, grape seeds on winemaking, and what impacts do they have, and is it a positive or negative effect, and how do you deal with it from a winemaking perspective?
Well, there's a couple things. The seeds are a source of a tremendous amount of tannin, and one of the reasons, if you hear people talk about trying to handle their grapes gently when they come into the winery, is that, above all, you don't want, if you're moving the wine around after it's been crushed or during crushing, you really want to be careful that you're not breaking those seeds at all. I think for the kinds of wines that we're making and the vineyards we're working with, the seeds are actually beneficial for us, because we have wines generally that have have a lot of color, and that tannin, when you have a lot of color, it helps to, those two can combine because they're in sort of the right proportions. I think if you're, with lighter skin varietals, sometimes, you can, and we've done it occasionally. A lot of wineries do it actually quite a bit. The seeds are going to fall down to because they're the heaviest thing in the fermentation, and you can simply draw off your juice And a lot of those seeds, after you've done that, will simply come out of the tank and you can remove them. But in general, we consider them to be, a good source of tannin.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, I want to thank everyone. We're top of the hour now, 5 o'clock here on the West Coast. So I want to thank our audience for joining us and thank you for your amazing questions. That's really helped to keep the conversation really lively and moving forward. And a big thanks to our panelists, Mark, David, and John. Thanks for your time today. And we will have, this is the first of more to come, so please stay tuned. We plan to have a whole series of roundtable, winemaker roundtables coming up. And we look forward to seeing you online again in the not too distant future. So thanks everybody, have a great evening.
Great.
Cheers.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.